Welcome to the exercise and automated insulin delivery systems for type 1 diabetes session. First of all, I'm going to say a massive thank you to Dessi. She produced a wonderful talk for our team. Unfortunately, I couldn't share that with you because there was some sensitive information within there, but I have used her best bits within this talk combined with some stuff that I've done before to hopefully provide you some insights on what is different for automated insulin delivery systems and how you can be system specific in terms of how you can support the people with type 1 diabetes manage exercise with regards to automated insulin delivery systems. So thank you, Dessi. I'll take the credit for you. So we're going to go through, first of all, why should we promote activity and exercise, and how can we support increasing activity and exercise? And then most importantly, for exercise specifically and the risk of hypoglycemia, how can we structure consultations and pump therapy or automated insulin delivery plans so we can support people exercise safely and effectively. I would like to start with this because if exercise was a drug that was in a pill, everyone would be popping it at a serious rate. The reason why I say that is this is from over 122,000 patients who had their activity levels measured in terms of peak output of performance, and they were bracketed into very low fitness, below average, above average, high and elite. And what you've got here is all-cause mortality over the next 8 years and the adjusted hazard ratio. So you can see from going from a very low level of fitness, peak metabolic equivalence, to below average, you get almost a 50% reduction in terms of your relative risk of all-cause mortality, and it just drops consistently the fitter that you get. And that's the same for both males and females. So really, it's not like sex specific. You get the benefits of being active. And what's really important when you look here is when you compare it to people who smoked who didn't smoke. Well, if you don't smoke or you do smoke, you have a 40% increased risk. If you had diabetes, it's a 40% increased risk. Even if you had end-stage renal disease, it's almost a threefold increased risk. But when you compare from going from low to elite fitness, you get a fivefold reduction or reduction increase of the risk. Even if you go from low to below average, almost a twofold reduction in risk. So just improving your overall fitness by small amounts has huge implications for your overall risk of dying and health. So if this was a pill, it would be the blockbuster. So what you have at your fingertips is something personally and professionally to really support people improve their health. The downside being, you can't pop this thing in a pill. You got to get your ass moving to get the benefits. So that's the challenge. Why does it work? Well, when you usually take a drug, it usually works on one system. But when you move your body and you're active and you put stress on your body, you basically look at every single system within your body, all metabolic and epigenetic pathways. It's impossible to go all through of these, but what I'm trying to say is if you had a drug that did all these things, it would be a multi-billion-dollar winner. So bear that in mind. And bear that in mind to what the basics are in terms of human movement and what we should do to reap the benefits of being physically active. If you're an adult, you should be doing at least 30 minutes a day or 150 minutes a week of moderate to vigorous intensity physical activity. Fast walking, moving around, something that gets the heart beating. As children and people, that should be 300 minutes a week, 60 minutes a day. And there should also be 2 to 3 times a week of doing something that really puts your body under stress to strengthen it, and minimizing your sedentary time watching TV. So this is time for you to be honest with yourself, depending on where you are on this scale. Are you meeting even the basic levels of activity? And if you're not, what chances have you of getting your patients to do it if you're not willing to do it yourself? So with that in mind, less than 10% of people worldwide actually meet the activity movement targets, and children with type 1 diabetes have lower activity levels than their peers, and fear of hypos is a major barrier for that. And less than 20% of adults actually meet this worldwide as well. So we are hugely underdosing on the most powerful tool we have at improving our health. So bear that in mind, take a self-assessment and think about improving your health through activity. And it doesn't have to be massive. For people with type 1 diabetes, some great work by Matthew Campbell that's yet to be published from Sunderland in the UK, that even 3 minutes of movement every 30 minutes, i.e. getting up and making a brew and moving around, can improve time in range by 14% compared to those who just sit all day. So it doesn't have to be massive to get some time in range improvements. And I really love this study. Dessi put me onto this a while ago. And this is people with and without type 1 diabetes, 12 and adults with type 1 and 12 controls. And what you can see on one day, they got them to come into the lab, have their usual meals and do no activity after breakfast, lunch and evening meal. And then the other group, they had to do 30 minutes of movement every hour for the hours after breakfast, lunch and evening meal. Nothing crazy, just walking around what would represent working on a ward, walking around moving, or being active for 30 minutes. And what you'll notice for the controls, the people without type 1 diabetes, their postprandial glucose excursions were significantly lower than the people who just sat on their backsides. So this is an improvement for people without type 1 diabetes, just as it's an improvement for people with type 1 diabetes. So what you should take care of this of, if you're educating a family, especially children and young people, it's an everybody thing. Just because someone's got a continuous glucose monitor with type 1 diabetes and you get to actually see the benefit of it, this is also happening for people without type 1 diabetes. So it's thinking about getting this functional movement in across the day to really improve glucose levels. The beauty of if you have type 1 diabetes, you get to see it on your CGM. This is what we teach at the Children's. We kind of teach regardless of the meal that you have, and ideally you want as many balanced meals as possible with a carb, a fat and a protein. If you put activity in for 10 to 15 minutes after eating, you get a much flatter glucose profile. So this is a standard young person who has Cocoa Pops on the weekend, chocolate covered cereal, and this is when they have it during the week when they walk to school. You can see that being active supercharges that insulin, therefore you don't get as many postprandial rises. And if you have a balanced breakfast, such as egg on toast, for example, you'll get a little bit of a rise, but if you put activity in, you almost get a flat line. And again, if you're having a high fat meal, and you want something to supercharge that insulin and keep the delayed rise under control, being active 2 to 3 hours after eating really curtails that. So you can use activity after eating to really benefit the glucose levels, whilst also knowing that's going to have a huge impact on your future health. So at this point, I want to split this and say, when we're just talking about basic movement, walking around, being active, that is a time in range tool. That's going to improve your time in range, not increase your risk of hypoglycemia. It's just going to improve your time in range. But when we're thinking about structured exercise where we're increasing the intensity, we're increasing the duration to half an hour and beyond, then obviously we're going to have a hypoglycemia risk and we need to manage that. And that's what we're going to talk about in the second part of this talk. So it's important to think of what are the main risk factors for going low during exercise. And this was a wonderful study which actually looked at, I think, close to 10,000 exercise events for people in the real world. And when people did have hypoglycemia, what were the things that preceded that hypoglycemia? And these are them labelled in the most important things. So the first of all was the glucose level at the start of exercise. Pretty simply, the lower you start, the higher the risk, which makes sense. If the glucose rate of change was dropping before exercise, the risk was increased. Makes sense. If the arrow is pointing down, you're going to be at higher risk. And this is the key one here when we start to think about automated insulin delivery systems and any type of therapy. If you have a lot of insulin on board from a previous bolus, either for a correction or for food, your risk is substantially increased. And then finally, we get type of exercise. Usually for most people, they talk about this first. Oh, if you're doing aerobic exercise, your risk of going low is very high. Well, you're forgetting the most important things first is what's your starting glucose? What's your trend arrow? Do you have insulin on board? The first three most important questions, and then type of exercise comes in at this point. Obviously, if people have experienced hypoglycemia in the previous 24 hours, they're at increased risk because their counter-regulatory hormone response, i.e. their ability to pump out adrenaline and glucagon, is diminished, therefore they're going to be at higher risk. But really, we need to tackle these in the right order. First of all, we need to educate people on what to do with glucose levels at the start of exercise. Should we change our plans based on where the trend arrow is? Think about how much insulin on board and how you can control that. Yes, type of exercise. So we'll tackle them in that order. This is a nice heat map from the same group which basically shows the lower the glucose level starts, this is 5.5 here, this is close to 10 here, the lower you start the higher the risk is. And then this is the speed that the glucose is dropping, the faster it's dropping the higher the risk. So if you start at 5 with a fast dropping glucose, you've got a really high risk of going low during exercise. If you start at 10 and above and your glucose level is nice and steady, you have a very low risk. So knowing your glucose level and trend arrow at the start of exercise is king. This is the information from XTOD, which is quite useful for adults, certainly, and it basically brackets the starting glucose level in terms of what is your action. Obviously, if it's between 3.5 and 6.5, you're going to want to have some carbs and wait 15 minutes to get the glucose level back up. If you're sort of between 5.7 to 6.9, then obviously 15 grams of carbs should generally be fine. If you're between 7 and 10, you may need some extra quick acting carbs. If you're between 10 and 15, you'll probably be fine, and above 15, check for your ketones. But it has an important caveat here that depending on the trend arrow, you may need to change the carbs. So if you've got a level of 6 and the usual amount is 15 grams, but you've got a double arrow drop in, you would double that and make that 30 grams. However, if you've got a level of 6.9 with a double arrow going up, you may have none. So the trend arrow and glucose arrow combination is an easy way to provide extra carbohydrates during exercise to prevent hypoglycemia, and on the other side, prevent hyperglycemia. Now, I was involved with Dessi in terms of writing the ISPAD exercise guidelines, and we came up with some neat things in terms of grams of carbs per kilo per body weight for 30 minutes. And we put don't exceed 60 kg here because the gut has a limitation on how much glucose it can absorb. So this is technically correct. And if you worked it out, for example, you had a 30 kilo person, they needed half a gram for half an hour, so that would be 15 grams. And obviously that's easy for me to work out, but it's very difficult to give that plan to someone. So what you've got here is just something nice and simply, a little calculator that you've got access to within the resources, which puts that all together in a simple way of essentially popping someone's weight. You pop in how long doing the activity, and depending on their glucose level, this is for someone just on finger pricks, it tells you how many carbs they would need, and then what you can go down and then see what type of fast-acting carbohydrate that they prefer to have during exercise to make sure the glucose level stays up. Obviously, there's no point in providing chocolate during this point because it's not going to work fast enough to be absorbed. So again, that's just a simple way of converting guidelines into useful resources. Obviously, when we throw continuous glucose monitoring into the mix, there's a couple of things we need to think about. When you're doing a finger prick, you're measuring the glucose level that's directly in the blood. However, when you're doing a continuous glucose monitoring measurement, you're measuring the glucose in the interstitial space, or what I call the fat tissue. The key thing here is usually that's 5 minutes behind what's happening in the blood when the dynamics are stable. However, when you throw in exercise and you change the dynamics of the blood flow, you change the dynamics of the fluid exchange, this time changes from 5 minutes potentially up to 20 minutes. So you can get a really big discrepancy when the glucose level is dropping fast, where the actual blood glucose is a lot lower than the CGM value. So how can we think about this? So as I've just told you, the lag can change from 5 minutes to potentially up to 20 minutes difference, all due to changing fluid dynamics and metabolic changes. So first of all, try to use a system that is the most accurate. And we know that the Freestyle Libre 2 and 3 and Dexcom G6 and G7 are the ones with iCGM FDA approval with the highest level of accuracy. What you can do is set the glucose alert higher to inform you at an earlier stage, and also set a faller rate. And finally, if you know that the glucose level is dropping fast and you see the arrows going down and it's approaching the lower levels, get out the blood glucose meter and do a finger prick, because we know it's going to be a lot lower on the finger prick than it is on the CGM. And these systems are not going to know and understand this. So just because a system has an indication for no finger pricks required, you as the user and you as the educator know that in certain circumstances, in fast falling glucose levels during exercise, you will need to do the occasional finger prick, especially when you've got arrows going down fast and lower glucose levels. And it's imperative that you speak to your children, young people, or people you're supporting, that they understand this. There's still very much limitations with regards to CGM and automated insulin delivery systems when the glucose level is moving very fast in exercise, for example. Obviously, the CGM brings a level of complexity with plans, so I just showed you the self-monitoring blood glucose guidance, and then you throw it in and say, well, what about where the glucose level is and where the trend arrow is going? How do we change that? And obviously, you've got varying amounts that you can change it by, and this is technically correct and technically a good guide, but practically it's pretty useless. And I can say that because I actually did this table and thought it was the bee's knees, and then I had loads of people come up and go, yeah, that's great, but I'm not sure I'll use it in practice. So what we've developed where I work is some simple guides where you pop in someone's weight, you pop in how long they're doing it, and it gives you a guide based on glucose level and trend arrow, the grams of carbs needed, and then you can change what that would be in terms of actual practical amounts of fast-acting carbs. You can get access to these within the Survive and Thrive guides within this study day, and you can then obviously use those for people if you think that they will be useful. What is to come is Othmar Moser is also the lead author and exercise and type 1 diabetes extraordinaire researcher, and they're working with a startup team to develop an app that takes into account this guidance and the adult guidance and putting it into an app where you can link your CGM to it, and it will give you a glucose reading and a suggested amount of carbohydrate for a certain number of minutes. And I'm led to believe there will also be some AI within there to let you know, depending on your glucose performance, what differences you would do next time. So again, good things to come, but in the meantime, you might have to deal with PDF plans and some trial and error. What carbs should you take on board just before and during exercise? Well, if you're going to be testing every 20 to 30 minutes and supplying extra carbohydrates, you're going to want that carbohydrates to be absorbed and be in the bloodstream pretty pronto. So you want kind of glucose-based fluid or glucose-only options such as glucose-based drinks, dextrose tablets, etc., or even sucrose like candy and sweets. However, if someone's only going to measure their glucose level every hour, then maybe you'll get away with things which are slower absorbed, such as bananas, chocolate bars, fruit, etc. So again, asking the right questions is important. Underrated, and in my opinion, the most important pre-planning question is, when are you eating with regards to doing the exercise? If you are going to be doing the exercise within 2 hours of eating, you will really need to consider if you do an insulin reduction at that meal before. Because if you go into exercise with the full insulin on board, regardless of what type of exercise you're doing, you're likely to drop. And Jane Yardley's done some fantastic work showing that most people think, well, resistance exercise or HIIT training will make your glucose level go up. But if you do that within the presence of bolus insulin on board in the last couple of hours, it will be dropping. So insulin on board is king. So ask that question, are you going to be eating and giving insulin within the couple of hours? If so, we need to be thinking about insulin reductions. And this is from a nice study where, on average, people doing exercise in the 2 to 4 hours after eating, there was a 44% risk of hypoglycemia. However, if they started their activity with a glucose level with insulin on board of less than 10, there was an 80% risk. So it just kind of shows you if your glucose level is less than 10, you've got full insulin on board, you're pretty much guaranteed to go low if you're doing sort of more than 30 minutes of exercise, and you will need to either take on board a lot of carbohydrates or ideally think about an insulin reduction at the meal prior. Aspirationally, you would want to make sure that the person has done their insulin for their meal 3 hours before. That way the insulin for the meal will have completely or very close to be out of the system. And most importantly, the meal that you've eaten, the carbohydrates and the glucose will have gone from the digestive system. They will be in your muscles ready to power the activity. Not always possible with children and young people because they very often don't leave 3 hours of gaps to eat, but certainly for adults that's a lot easier to achieve. What type of meals? A mixed meal will be ideal with some carbohydrates in. So again, just to make sure that someone's stocked up and ready to go. But in an ideal world, this kind of idea of meal and insulin 3 hours before exercise is something, if someone wants reproducible and consistent glucose results, really works well. Type of exercise then comes in at this point. So think about glucose level first, trend arrow second, is there insulin on board, and then finally type of exercise. So in principle, endurance one-pace exercise will make your glucose level drop. Very explosive exercise that pushes adrenaline out and glucagon and growth hormone is likely to make your glucose level rise. High intensity interval training might make you go up or low depending on the duration and the intensity, and similar for resistance training. However, you chuck on board insulin on board, like here, everything, all bets are off. If you're doing endurance exercise with lots of insulin on board, you're going to drop faster. Even explosive exercise, you may stay the same. HIIT, you're going to drop. Resistance, you're going to drop. So again, insulin on board is king when it comes to thinking about what will happen to the glucose level. Making sure that if you are exercising within that 2-hour window, you think about reducing the insulin at that time. One good thing about automated insulin delivery systems is, previously, what would happen is people would do exercise, which is here, and this is someone who's on a standard glucose and insulin infusion, which means when you see this level go up, they had to pump loads more glucose in to keep the glucose level the glucose level at the same level. So obviously this basically means they're more sensitive to insulin at this point, requiring more glucose, which is you would expect after the exercise. But most importantly, what used to happen is 7 to 11 hours after the exercise, there would be more glucose required, i.e. more sensitive to insulin through the night. That's why people would describe having hypoglycemia at 2 to 3 o'clock in the morning, and obviously then putting them off exercise. One good thing about these systems is they basically adjust the basal insulin overnight so that doesn't happen. So that's almost a thing of the past on the automated insulin delivery systems, which is great, but we also have to be a little bit careful what happens straight after the exercise. Obviously, previously, people would reduce the insulin overnight or just have a snack without any insulin, so that is still something to consider. But on the automated insulin delivery systems, the actual ability to change that basal rate is something that prevents that hypoglycemia risk overnight. So now we've got all that information, how do we bag out structuring a consultation? Well, the first thing you need to do is think about the patient and their goal. Is it someone who wants to lose weight? Therefore, we're going to focus on insulin reductions. Is it someone who wants to drive performance and they want to make sure that their nutrition is optimized? Therefore, we'll think about giving extra carbohydrates. We've already talked about type of exercise, duration and intensity, and we've talked a lot about bolus insulin conditions that insulin on board. And what we will get to with the automated insulin delivery systems is the automated insulin delivery systems adjust these basal conditions all the time, which can present some challenges. And obviously with children and young people, if the activity is planned, you've got a lot of opportunity for insulin changes, but if the activity is unplanned, you're looking at extra carbs to support them. And obviously if you've got an idea of previous hypoglycemia, that can be brought into the picture too. Most importantly, we know that whatever plan you set, the chances of it working first time and being reproducible are probably pretty low. So it's important to inform the people who you're supporting that the plan you're going to come up with is the best you can do, bearing in mind it will depend on the exercise type, the duration, the time of day, how much insulin board you've got, what's your fitness level, is it competition, is it not competition, what gender are you? How did you sleep the night before? Has there been previous days of hypoglycemia? So it's important to inform them that the plans that you're going to support them with will be your best guess. They will need some adaptation. They will not necessarily be reproducible all the time, and they will take some trial and error. That isn't to say that the plans that you're going to give are bad, but there's nothing worse than someone receiving a plan going, do you know what? I've got this plan for you. It's going to work perfectly. And off you go. And then it doesn't. And then all of a sudden someone is let down by the expectations. So we know that there's loads of things that influence the glucose levels. And it's important to make people aware that plans are our best guesses. And we'll get there with some trial and error. That being said, that's a lot of information and a prelude to how we involve AID systems with exercise. But if you don't have that background, what we're about to talk about now will be useless. So now you understand what questions we've got to ask and what plans we can develop. How do we actually tailor those to the different systems? First of all, we've talked a lot previously about the activity mode setting that you can set. So it's important to know how these ones work. So first of all, the 780G, wherever you have the default target setting at, when you put the temp target at, ideally 90 to 120 minutes before, it will increase the target level, then therefore meaning increases in insulin will be slower and there will be no auto corrections, and it will suspend the insulin earlier. But it's important to note that it doesn't actually alter the aggressiveness of the algorithm. So it's just important to know that. The tandem control IQ changes from the target level where it usually is to pushing the target level up to 7.8 to 8.9. So again, it suspends the insulin earlier and doesn't make the increases as fast, but it does still give auto corrections, and there's a way around that which we'll discuss later. The CAM APS, you obviously have personalized glucose targets where you'll set wherever you want. Usually the default's at 5.8. And importantly, it will push that target level up by about 2 to 3 millimoles per litre when you put the ease off on. And also importantly, it will reduce the delivery by about 30%. So again, providing an extra layer of protection. The Omnipod 5, when you put the activity mode on, will raise the target to 8.3, and importantly to know that it will actually reduce the aggressiveness of the algorithm by about directionally 50%. So whichever system that you use, getting this activity mode on 90 minutes before is beneficial, because what you're doing is you're limiting the amount of insulin that the system can pump in prior to exercise, therefore limiting the insulin on board and reducing the risk of hypoglycemia. However, if you're being active within 2 hours of the exercise, just putting the activity mode on will not be enough. And this is shown clearly in this study, where you've got 3 conditions. You have UFB, which is usual target and full bolus, which is here in the red. And you can see here, no activity mode put on, usual bolus. It still rises a little bit before, a lot of insulin on board, and a lot of hypoglycemia within 20 to 30 minutes of the exercise. However, even if you give the full bolus and put the activity mode on here, you can see there's very little difference and you still end up with a lot of hypoglycemia. It's only when you do a 33% reduction in the bolus insulin and put the activity mode on, yes, the glucose level does go a bit higher, but you stay away from hypoglycemia. Obviously, this is aerobic exercise for kind of 45 to 60 minutes, but it does show if you're going to be very active for say more than 30 minutes within 2 hours of eating and giving insulin with these systems, you still need to dial in less carbs, maybe by the tune of 25 to 33% to reduce the risk of hypoglycemia. And this just actually shows the number of people when you don't do anything, you give the full bolus and don't put the activity mode on, almost everyone has a high level of hypoglycemia. Just the activity mode alone, you still have half the people with lots of hypoglycemia. And when you do the bolus reduction plus the activity mode, you only have 1, 2, 3, 4 out of 33 people are experiencing hypoglycemia. So you're still going to need, for aerobic activity, certainly a bolus reduction. And the same group actually repeated the study, but this time did the bolus reductions either at 60 minutes before exercise or 90 minutes before exercise. And what you can see here from a glucose level perspective, excuse me, is that if you do the bolus reduction 90 minutes before exercise, you do get a slight increase in the glucose levels before exercise. Whereas if you do the 60 minutes before exercise, well, actually you don't get a higher increase in the glucose level. So you kind of get away with doing those bolus reductions with just an hour before. That's the best if you want lower exposures to high glucose levels after, and you won't end up with hypoglycemia. So pretty much the story is get the activity mode on 90 minutes before, and if you're eating within the 2 hours, probably about a 25% reduction is a safe place to start. What do you need to do afterwards? So this was a study that looked at 33 adults. They had their last meal and food at 1 p.m. They put the exercise target on at 2 p.m. and then they exercised at 4. So they obeyed that 3-hour rule. And what they saw, they did 3 different types of exercise on 3 different conditions: a high intensity protocol, a resistance exercise protocol, and just a moderate aerobic exercise protocol. They kept the exercise target on immediately after exercise, and they didn't eat for 4 hours. Then they had their evening meal at 20 to 9 of a usual carb meal. And what they were getting at is, does the activity mode in this situation prevent the risk of hypoglycemia? They're looking at, when you have the meal delayed afterwards, do you end up then going hypoglycemic afterwards? What you will notice is there was an increased exposure to hypoglycemia with this meal after exercise, but interestingly, it was only for the resistance exercise, not for the moderate intensity exercise. So it might suggest that the usual plans for pump therapy that most people would say would be, oh, for the meal after a very heavy exercise session, you would reduce the dose by 50%. That will definitely be too much. Maybe a 25% reduction would be a safe place to start. But what's most important to notice is there was no temporary target left on overnight, and actually the system was at a very low level of hypoglycemia compared to exercise days, compared to non-exercise days. So pretty simply, what I take from this study is the activity mode is not required overnight, and generally you will need very little insulin reductions at the meal afterwards, maximum sort of 25%, maybe if anything. One thing to be aware with these systems that we've never seen before is when you put these activity modes on here, like on the Medtronic, like on here, on the T-Slim, what you will see is the basal delivery basically shuts off for the period before the exercise and during the exercise, which means that you may have no basal insulin going in for up to 2 to 3 hours. Now, we would have never suggested this before on insulin pump therapy or injections, because we know that if you put no insulin on board and you have very little insulin within the portal vein, as soon as you eat a meal afterwards, you're going to go sky high, which is here what you can see. And on both of these instances, we advise the children and young people to actually reduce their bolus insulin by reducing the carbs entered, which was a mistake and we've learned from now. But the usual plans of reducing the bolus insulin afterwards is a bad idea, because there's been a lack of insulin during the exercise because these pumps have been suspended for long periods of time. So it's just something to be aware of, that what you will never used to be seeing these spikes after exercise previously on these systems, we're likely to be seeing post-meal, well, the spikes in the glucose is for meals after the exercise because of prolonged insulin suspensions during exercise. And we might need to do things like certainly giving the full amount of insulin for the food, or certainly not doing 50% reductions to the food. We'll have to get the activity mode off as soon as we finished. Maybe on a CAM APS you could use the boost function. Maybe it needs a small bolus. There's lots of things we can do to make sure we get insulin back in that portal vein, so that when we eat, a lot of the glucose is captured within the liver. This is a fantastic paper by Dessi and her colleagues, which basically puts everything that I've said together in a nutshell, which is often you'll need combination strategies, which is setting the exercise target 1 to 2 hours before and reducing the mealtime insulin by maybe 25% if you're going to be eating within the 1 to 3 hours pre-exercise. So I could have just put this table up at the beginning without all the evidence and you could have known what to do, but it's important to know what the evidence is behind it. Obviously, we need to set the exercise target ideally 1 to 2 hours in advance, or you could just reduce the bolus insulin. If you are someone who wants be in control of the insulin conditions, you could exit automated mode and go back into manual mode prior to the exercise, so you're in control of the insulin conditions. And I've got a little case study to show why that might be beneficial for athletes who want ultimate control over their insulin conditions and glucose behavior during the exercise. Obviously checking as you're going along and drip feeding carbohydrates during exercise. So you don't want to put a full whack of an hour's worth of carbohydrates in prior to exercise, because that's going to push the glucose high, send the algorithm into overdrive and cause hypoglycemia. You want to drip feed these carbs in sort of every 20 minutes or so. Obviously, if you're taking the pump off, suspend it so the algorithm doesn't think that it's good giving insulin to you. And obviously, overnight, you can just switch the temporary target off and not have it on, because these systems should be able to cope fine. So that paper is well worth a read. It's got loads of practical tips and tricks and nuggets. A really great paper to give you lots of information on how to manage AID and exercise practically. So putting that together, at Birmingham, what we use called the T25, which is very simply get the target on before you start, reduce the insulin by reducing the carbs entered by 25% if you're eating within 2 hours before exercise. As soon as you finish T, get the target off, and maybe a 25% reduction in the bolus insulin afterwards, but you'll have to see what happens. That's a really simple place to start, and obviously drip feeding the carbs according to the chart during. Now, if you try that plan, but you go high, then next time don't do any bolus reductions and maybe don't put the temporary target on. This might happen if you're doing HIIT training or resistance training, for example. Or it might be that you go hypo doing this plan, and next time you'll reduce the carbs you entered by 50% and obviously make sure you got the target on. Maybe keep the target on for longer afterwards. So there's just a simple adjustment protocol there. But if you remember T25, you're not going to go too far wrong as the starting point. This is someone who followed the T25. So you can kind of see here where the activity mode is on here. They reduced the insulin that they entered at the meal before. They put the activity mode on, although they forgot to do it 90 minutes before. They had supplementary carbohydrates during, and then they reduced the insulin by 25% afterwards, turned the activity mode obviously wasn't on, and they cruised fine overnight. So there's just a simple example of kind of how it works practically. Here's another case study. This is someone who was on a 7-HCG, 90 kilo young man, was going for a jog at 4 p.m, had a meal within that 2 hour period of 24 grams carbs. The glucose at the start was 4.2, is 4.9 halfway through, managed it well, and then afterwards was eating 85 grams carbs. So this is sort of the plan of what you were thinking of what we did. And what you can see here is we reduced the carbs by half, we put the activity mode on, sort of did drop down a little bit, but managed it just about. Was fine afterwards, but then obviously we did the big bolus reductions at the meals afterwards, and he went super high because during this period there was no insulin going on. So next time we forgot the insulin reductions that we put on of 50%, and we actually scaled those back. So it's just a real life example of kind of this phenomenon of lack of insulin during exercise leading to lack of insulin in the portal vein for when you finish. So there's not enough insulin to capture the glucose from the meal in the liver. So the T25 is a standard for someone who just wants to do recreational activity. However, if you've got athletes and people who want consistent insulin conditions, they want a reproducible glucose response during exercise, you really need to think about going back into open loop mode at least 90 minutes before exercise, because what that will do, it will go back to the manually set basal rate, it won't be altering the insulin, therefore by the time they start the activity they will know exactly how much insulin is in their system, therefore they'll know how much carbohydrates they need to manage the length of exercise that they do. But what you'll need to make sure is you have your manually set basal rates correct, and that in an ideal world you adhere to the 3-hour rule where you have your last meal and insulin 3 hours before, so that when you start exercise, that basal insulin that you've set back to open loop mode 90 minutes ago is the only insulin that's kind of working within the system. Therefore, the reproducibility of the glucose results should be a lot more consistent than if you have an automated insulin delivery system, which is up in the insulin and down in the insulin every 5 minutes, making inconsistent insulin delivery and therefore inconsistent results. So this is a young girl of ours who has happily shared this information. She's a triathlete, 13-year-old, training 20 hours a week. Very, very variable training from aerobic to HIIT sessions, sprint sessions, cycling, swimming, running. Hates the idea of being attached to a pump, hates the session being interrupted by hypo, so runs high. So this is her life on multiple day injections. You can just see the level of variability, hypoglycemia overnight, the different training sessions. I mean, we spent hours trying to figure out an MDI regime to try and manage this. And maybe it's just because I'm not very good at doing this, but we tried for hours and hours to try and sort things out, but we really struggled. And we eventually convinced her to say, well, look, how about a 3-week trial of going on an Omnipod, because there's no wire, and obviously what we can do is you want to be in control of the insulin conditions, so we'll go back into manual mode 90 minutes before exercise. You'll be back in control. If you want to run a little bit higher during exercise, not a problem, but how about we get you time in range for the other parts of the time and let the system, especially overnight, get rid of all these nasty hypoglycemia situations that we can't manage on the current injections, because your insulin requirements are just so variable that all over the chart, it's almost impossible to manage, is impossible to manage on MDI. So this is her a couple of weeks after, 75% time in range, minimal lows, overnight, absolutely flying in perfectly. Yes, still some variability during the day, and obviously some manual mode, which we'll go through in a second, but this is chalk and cheese, absolute chalk and cheese, and improved performance times, improved the way she's feeling, better sleep for the parents, better sleep for her. So obviously she's not keen on giving it back. Don't get me wrong, she doesn't love the fact that she's still got a pod stuck to her, but for her performance levels, it's improved things so much, and in sleep, for example, that she's willing to forego wearing an extra piece of kit to get the benefits of everything else. And this is just to show you of getting back in control of the insulin conditions. So here, obviously it went a little bit low with a meal. There was still an insulin reduction, but by going back into manual mode, she was able to take back charge. Here again, back into manual mode 90 minutes before, sailed in perfectly, and again back into manual mode. So for her, the importance of going back into manual mode meant she was in control of the conditions. She knew what extra carbohydrates she was taking on board, which is roughly 15 to 20 grams per half an hour, would actually manage it fine. Whereas if we'd have left it in, say, automated mode, there'd have been extra insulin going in here, there would have been extra insulin going in here, and would have had problems down here. So for athletes who want control of their insulin conditions, this is a nice compromise, being able to go back into manual mode to give the flexibility, but also then the beauty of overnight. And you look at all these pauses and suspends in insulin that are different from day to day depending on the training. You have got no chance with the standard pump or injections on managing this. Absolutely no chance. So again, it just kind of shows these systems are amazing, but for exercise, if you want to take control back of these conditions just for exercise, do that, but also get the benefit of the automated insulin delivery system when things are a little bit more stable. Here's some extra tips and tricks. Obviously with a T-Sim and Control IQ, you can set a different profile for exercise where you can reduce the basal rates, the correction factors and sensitivity factors. Very good for weekend warriors who love to go for 5-hour cycles, for example. If you want to stop auto corrections during the exercise, you can just do a little manual bolus of 0.05 before you start. Because it can only give an auto correction every hour, that will stop it. And obviously an important reminder to update to version 7.7 so you can do a duration for the activity mode rather than having to start it and stop it. Important to avoid prolonged suspensions of more than 120 hours. So if you're seeing this happen, then maybe you need to do a short bolus of the missed basal, or you could use CAM APS, you could use the boost afterwards. And one good thing about the CAM APS is you can set the ease off or boost up to 24 hours in advance. So if you've got parents who know that their children and young people are not going to set this thing, they can set it in the morning, for example, for before PE or before exercise, which is an added advantage to that system. One thing that is new, and you will hear about in the next session, is something going on here, team sport. Not necessarily a very compliant individual, 150 grams carbs here. And then obviously nothing that goes in, and then the glucose level rises, and all of a sudden, bang, lows. And if you know anything about team sports in the UK, what you should know is, for teenagers, especially 17, 18, 19-year-olds, that often comes with a night out afterwards. Could be 5 or 6 beers, which pushes the glucose level high. There's been no target put on, which means that the glucose level goes high, the system goes into overdrive, despite the long suspends, lots of hypoglycemia. So it's important to educate on, get that activity mode on if you're going to be drinking alcohol, because it will reduce, in this case, the insulin aggressiveness by 50% on the Omnipod 5 and also elevate that target level. So it's important to educate on that, because this could be a serious problem if people don't, because these systems are going to be wanting to drive the glucose level down to target, and they're going to be at high risk of hypoglycemia if they're consuming lots of units of alcohol. But there's more on that on the next session. So in summary, going back to the beginning, activity is the best medicine and a family approach is what you need. Exercise requires a structured plan, and one thing that we do need to know with the automated insulin delivery systems, think of the T25, T25. I would encourage you to go and read these guidelines and obviously all the resources within here. So that's a fairly long session on exercise, but hopefully it captures everything you will need. And a huge thanks to Dessi, because basically I've stolen a lot of her material, or borrowed it anyway. But she's the real professional. I'm just kind of borrowing her stuff.